Normally I start from back to front, which is what we did in the class, and go all the way back to the sky. But here I just laid out some of the darker areas that are under and beneath these foreground plants, just to get that dark in as a base color. And this is a hooker's green or a dark green. You could also mix some red in with it to give it an even darker tone. And it's just basically the background shadows underneath these trees, just to get that down and to dry. I also sped up this tutorial from an hour and a half to about 30 minutes. And you feel free to pause anytime you need to. But I also tried to remove some of the spaces and the gaps where I was just changing out paint colors or walking away from the canvas for a few minutes. And here we are breaking in the sky, and this is with a cerulean, a light cerulean blue and a lot of white mixed in to create a really light toned sky. As we discussed in the class, this is your sky and you can make it however you want. You could create an entirely blue, bright sky with some soft white wispy clouds, but for this purpose in the tutorial, we're using the drama that we saw in the show, and of course Outlander's always full of drama, which makes it kind of fun. So this is just getting that base soft sky color in before we move on and start creating the clouds. And the shadows in the clouds, you can get through a lot of ways of mixing complementary colors to get different tones of grays, but for the purpose of just creating a lavender here, I just added a ultramarine blue and a crimson, mixed them together to get, and of course a lot of white to get this soft lavender tone that is the shadows of my clouds. And again, I did a template on there just to kind of guide you, but feel free to move your clouds any way you want. For some reason, with the eye, it is more pleasing to see clouds kind of moving more in a horizontal direction as opposed to completely vertical. So even though these are kind of cottony, billowy clouds, they have like a support underneath that moves in more of a horizontal direction, if that makes sense. And this is one of my favorite parts of the painting, is getting the sky in, and we'll always come back to adding our white highlights to it later after we've gotten most of these shadows in. And these are some of the pinks which I use, adding a crimson and a lot of white together. This scene also has some coral tones to it as well, so we're going to be using a kind of an orange and white and yellow and white to add in some of the coral highlights near the end, and I saved some of those highlights for the end of this tutorial. When the coral or orange bit blends in with this blue, those are complementary colors, so it makes more of a grayish tone, which is nice for the darker drama of the clouds. And I did want to thank you all too for participating in my class, and we are talking about a totally different scene for the fall Frasers Ridge gathering, and I'm really looking forward to that, and we'll have some more information on that once we've solidified what we're doing. But I really enjoyed this crowd, and I wish we had stayed longer, so my husband and I are now talking about participating a little bit more in the next event, because it's just such a great, fun group of people. And this link is going to be available to you for 2 weeks before it closes down, to be able to use this and walk through your painting. I am going to be, I guess, breaking this down into more steps and details and putting it on a different platform to eventually sell as a download for anyone who wants to do this tutorial on their own in their home. But for now, and for you guys only, I'm sent this out, and it is a free link for you for the next 2 weeks to be able to use in your home. And so that's that darker undertone I was talking about, that's more of a horizontal across the sky, bringing in a little bit more of the dark purple just as a frame underneath the clouds. There was a lot of drama that day, And since then, in some of the newer episodes, I've seen other return shots to this, especially when Jamie took Willie out and they had to go camping together. He brought him to the same location and they looked out over the scene, and it was pretty different. So I think it's interesting now that you've painted this scene to go back and see the other episodes that feature this and how they modify it for the different shows. But different times of year, and as we discussed, you can bring in as many of the fall colors as you want to down in the trees. But one of my most favorite parts of this entire scene is the little waterfall that we get to create at the end. I'm hoping you'll be able to hear some of the birds that are behind me, because we were outside actually doing this painting class, and we had a creek right beside us, and we heard the creek and the birds, and it was really lovely. I believe that was actually my first time teaching a painting class outdoors, come to think of it. So this is the year we have a little reprieve. I forgot to remove, and I may still go back and delete this out. All right, continuing on with the sky, I guess I decided to go ahead and add in some of those highlights, and these are the yellow and white. Boy, this paint dries so fast. Acrylic paint, that's one of the things I do love about it. You can just keep on working. So we are throwing in some of those highlights right now before we get down into the mountains. Through the process of preparing this scene and then recording this scene and then doing it live with the students, I think I've painted this scene 3 times so far, so every single one of them turned out a little different, which is what's exciting to see how each of yours turned out different. And I would love it if you come back onto the Facebook group once you've completed your painting and show your version. I think that would be exciting for other people to see, and the ones who didn't make it to this class were even asking me for that, to be able to see the samples. A lot of people in the class had not finished their painting yet, so we didn't take pictures of everyone's, but that would be great if you can come back and show it to the group. Okay, we're coming up on finishing the sky. I'm adding a little bit more of the blue back in, which you can also do just to create more of that negative space around your clouds. If you feel like you've covered too much of the sky up, you can always come back in, throw it back in. That also gives it some blending as well. You're blending the blue back into it. This guy has a lot of drama. Okay, so we're going to take that cerulean, make it a little bit darker, less white. And again, this is up to you as far as how soft you want your clouds to be in the background. During the morning time in Blue Ridge, we were talking about how at every moment the mountains in the distance change. And some days they're very soft, some days the clouds are completely covering them, and some days they're more prominent. So for this painting, I thought they just need to be a little bit darker than the sky itself, and then you keep adding in a darker cerulean, they become more and more intense. Everything in the background to push it back needs to have a little white to soften it up, or even the complementary color to gray it up and basically soften the color so it's not as intense, never straight from the bottle or the tube. And we can blend all of these together to make these rolling hills. It's just tones of the cerulean. You might even want to add a little bit of crimson in there in the shadows of the mountains. for some Purple Mountain Majesty. Okay, this big mountain is closer, so we are seeing some of the green on it, of the trees. When I looked at the scene in the show, the majority of the entire picture is just tones of green, which is a lot of green. So for the purpose of this tutorial, I did go in and break up some of the green with other colors. So that's why our mountains in the background are definitely blue. And in this field here, this is basically the framing of your river. I made the river wider than it appears to be in the show, and we've got areas of the green trees, but we're going to bring in there a lot more of our gold or yellow ochre, so create a little bit more of a fall time. Just basically getting some of the base color of these trees in, the greens. This is when it gets kind of fun to use your little flat brush and flick it up to create your trees. The top has a strong highlight on it from the light in the distant right. I think we'll end up putting some gold up there. And again, this is just getting our base colors in. Some of you had said in the class just to use it the class time as the base colors, and then you can go home and add in this detail. So that's still what we're doing now. I love making most of this field predominantly just kind of a pretty harvest gold to just separate out all the different sections of this painting. So we're kind of blending these greens together. It's like a sage green mixed with the gold. And it's all muted with white, just to keep it softer, and that's going to help the plants in the foreground really pop. Okay, now we're going back to our cerulean just to fill in our little river, winding river. We're going to have a place on there that we actually add a white highlight to it. Along that edge, there you go, around that little curve. Taking the green. You can use a brown, or you can take a green and mix some red in with it and get you a more of a neutral tone with the complement. Create some shadows on the mountain. And these are just more of the shadows in the trees, or actually some of the brown decaying trees of the fall that you see in the fall. Still covering our base colors that are out in the distance. One of the purposes of this dark also is a framework for us to put our little waterfall. The little white waterfall tends to pop because we've got the dark tones around it, as you'll see in a minute when we place the waterfall in. You can blend all of these things together pretty quickly. Actually, I'm working a lot quicker here than I did in real time because I have sped up the video about 150%. Okay, so bringing in some more highlights, lighter tones. And using the little trees, flicking the little trees up to overlap the river a little bit at that angle. fill in the rest of the field. Now the further you go off in the background, the less you're going to see trees, shapes coming up. Trying to add some variation of lights and darks into the whole area. This is creating more of the dark base for us to get our waterfall in there. Also wanted a few more darker trees around the river just to frame it a little bit. Some variety out in that field. There we go. I've been very interested in studying more about what's called Cross Creek because I spent most of my childhood going to visit my grandparents in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And it's not one of my favorite cities. My dad always said it was a great place to come from, but apparently there is a lot of history there. And I guess that's what they refer to as Cross Creek in the Outlander show. Okay, now we're getting into some of the foreground trees with our stronger greens. This is where we go a little bit more intense, not quite so muted. We've got trees on each side, and what we had discussed in the class is to make sure the tree on the left is a little taller than your center line and keep the tree on the right below the center line, and that way they're not too even. You want to break up the eye just a little bit. So I'm using these darker colors almost to a brown to create the shadows of the rocks. This is the base of the rocks. Brown or green and red together and create that darker tone. You want to paint around the side edges of your canvas, and then you can just hang it on a wall without the framing. Don't feel like you need to frame it. If it's painted, it's wrapped around canvas. Okay, this is where I'm using some yellow, ochre, gold. May want to mix in a little bit of that brownish tone to create the tops of the rocks. And these are your rocks. Rocks are fun because you can create them any way you want to. And we'll do some highlights later on those. But that's basically where they're standing in the show when they're looking out over this beautiful horizon. I'm using some of that gold as well on some of the base colors here before we put in our moss. As well as some of the gold in this tree. I was just trying to create a variation of different tones with all the plants to set them apart a little bit so they're not just all green. There's no just green anyway. There's so many tones of green when you start painting foliage, the way the light hits it. I'm going to make this bush a little bit more golden toned. Right here behind the rocks. There we go. build over into the tree as well. Sometimes it's fun when you're trying to stay loose and not get too tight, just to roll your brush around. Right now this is a really fun, it's like a lime green to use as a highlight on some of the bushes and plants. This is like a lime green mixed with white. There's also a color, one of my favorite colors of golden paints called green gold, that is beautiful. And that's what we ended up using in the class to create that moss down below, wrapping around the rocks. So you can choose more of a lime green, or you can mix the green gold in it as well. More of a golden tone. I'm just blending that in together some. I'm sorry I didn't have a better angle here for you to see the entire canvas. I'm missing out on a little bit of the far right corner. I'll have to get better with that. I spent many years as a muralist in Ponte Vedra, Florida, and one of the things I loved doing the most was gardens and foliage, because there's really no right or wrong. Those are your plants, and you create them the way you want them to be. Some of these darker greens here, to be able to create some separation, you want to may come in with some phthalo green or green mixed with phthalo blue. It's a really strong deep blue green. Create some more separation between the plants. And that's what we'll be doing here, is just that, creating more separation between the values of light and dark. Adding some more phthalo green to that right side tree over there to make it look a little different. And we use a little bit of the phthalo just as a really darker outline for that river, just to frame that river a little bit on that other bank. The bank we can see is on the right, and on the left we can't see the bank because of the top of the trees. So I'm creating a little bit deeper tones in here because I'm still getting ready to put that waterfall in there. Just wanted to make sure we had a good frame around it. Adding a little bit more depth. Still not going intense, but that's still a muted tone compared to our foreground rocks. And here it is. Blip, blip. Little waterfall. I haven't found this exact scene that exists anywhere yet in the areas between Blowing Rock and Boone, but I do have a close friend I grew up with who's a very famous photographer there in North Carolina, and I asked him if he thought this exact scene existed anywhere. To his knowledge, it did not, but there's a lot of land in that area that is private that you really can't get onto, even though he travels and does workshops all over the state of North Carolina. So it could exist, and it would be great if somebody came forward with the actual, but I think this was all photoshopped together for Outlander, to have the perfect waterfall next to the perfect river and the perfect mountain scene in the distance. And that's just fine. Just fine for us. My husband and myself, we both grew up in Winston-Salem, and that's where most all of our family still lives, so we do have a special place in our heart for the Blue Ridge Mountains, and for the fall, of course, and scenes like this. Now we're going in with a smaller brush and just creating a little bit more detail in some of our trees as they get closer. As they get closer along the banks there, you see the more definition to the treetops, not just solid colors. Adding some highlights to our rocks where the sun is hitting it. Just your yellow and white or gold. You could even throw some metallics in there if you like. And this is that really bright green gold I'm using to highlight the tree and some of the plants. It's such a pretty color. Of that onto the side of the mount too just really makes it pop. Again, it's a golden paint called green gold. It's really adding a lot of definition. Just go back and throw some of that in. Make sure you're blending it softly. Near the end of a painting, I usually like to go back in with titanium white and just throw in some highlights and pops. Sometimes I'll even seal the painting first and then do the highlights on top of the sealant, and it really makes it pop, stand out more. So we just did a highlight on the waterfall, and we did some highlights on the rocks. Now we're going to come back in and define that sky a little bit more. I think I had too much of the coral going out down into the horizon, and I wanted it to go back to the cerulean blue. That's what we love about acrylics. You can go back and fix anything that you want. Got a few more white highlights to some of the clouds, just on the side that is closest to the right light source. Just creating a little bit more coral definition to some of these clouds. Oh, the drama. Sometimes with clouds you might even want to add a little bit of glazing medium, and that keeps it soft and blending so it's not quite so intense coming against each other, since acrylics tend to dry so quick and you're coming back over all of this later. You might want to have a little glazing medium mixed in your paint. That just makes it so much more transparent. Not just white, but probably white with a little yellow mixed in. A touch of yellow goes a long way. Okay, we're finishing up with some highlights, and we're done.